In this lesson, we'll learn the basics of working with brushes here inside of Photoshop. Okay, fantastic. So go ahead and open up the Lesson 24 Begin file with me. You'll be able to follow right along. So when it comes to brushes here inside of Photoshop, one is probably going to immediately think the brush tool, the tool that I currently have selected. But in reality, so many more tools here inside of Photoshop are actually affected by the brush engine here inside. So thinking about brushes, if we were to maybe select something different, let's come up here and select the quick selection tool. If you remember when we learned about this tool, we learned that we can come in here and change some of the settings for the brush. Now, in this case, we only have settings for size, hardness, and spacing, but this is all settings that are brush related. So brushes really affect many of the tools here inside of Photoshop. Now, to illustrate this, let's just go ahead and grab the brush tool down here. Now, the keyboard shortcut for this is B, so real easy to remember. All right, so let's come up here first and let's look at the control panel. Now, there's a lot of different options up here for brushes. As a matter of fact, this particular icon looks just like the icon for the brush tool. This is a tool preset, and we haven't actually talked about this yet. We're going to learn about these in an upcoming lesson, but let's come over here to this little area right here where it says 22. That is actually the pixel size that I currently have set for my brush. Now, if I tap on this, you're going to see here, this particular drop down looks a little bit different than the quick selection tools brush drop down. So we're going to actually kind of take a look at this here. So obviously we have kind of this size slider at the top, and if I were to increase this or decrease it, you can see that it affects the pixel number right here above. Now this is the diameter of the brush tip. So you can see here, if I were to kind of increase this to a large size, you'll see that my cursor actually gives me a little bit larger preview in terms of what the size of my brush is. Now, hardness is a little bit different in terms of how do we explain that. So the best example I can give you is actually right down here. Now, these are actually called brush presets, and this actual dialog is called the brush preset picker. And you can see here there's a number of different brushes in here. We're not going to obviously touch on all of these types here in this lesson, but if we look at this one that I have the little blue outline around, this one is a hard brush. That outline or that contour of the brush tip is very crisp and very hard. So because of that, if I were to come over here and paint, you'll see here that the edges of the stroke that I paint are very, very hard. Now I'm going to undo that, but let's come back up here and take a look at this first brush right here. Notice how there's sort of a gradiated edge to that, sort of a soft edge. Watch this hardness slider when I select that. The hardness is actually reduced all the way down to 0%. So when I draw with that brush, we're going to get a very soft edge to it. So almost kind of a fuzzy edge. So that is what hardness is and how it affects the brushes you use. Now, when it comes to, again, these brushes in here, we also have this, which this is going to be really easy to kind of explain if I'm able to maybe use a hard edge brush. So this right here is going to control the rotation of the brush tip. So we can grab this little arrow right here, and it's actually going to rotate this particular brush tip. Now, this brush tip is a circle, so it's going to be harder to see. So if we were to come down and maybe grab this guy right here, and you can see kind of what that looks like. Let me make that a little larger for you. Now, if we begin to rotate this, watch what happens to that brush tip. If we rotate that around like so, you can see that preview of my brush tip is rotating. So that's what rotating your brush tip does. Now, ultimately, that's going to affect the stroke that you paint in terms of kind of the alignment of one of these asymmetrical brush tips. Now, not only that, but inside this dialog, let's switch back up to that hard brush. We can actually crush our brush tip. We can actually squish it. So if we grab these little circles right here, we can begin to pinch that in, sort of like so. And maybe rotate that around a little bit. And now look at this brush tip. You can see here that we have a little bit different type of stroke that we're able to paint. Now I want to come in and grab my eraser so I can get rid of this stuff really quickly here. We'll just kind of erase this back. because I want to jump over here to my brush, and I'm going to just tap on that same brush to reset those settings back there. So basically, every time we're making changes to size, hardness, and even the rotation of the brush tip, as well as the diameter of that brush tip, we're changing what's known as dynamics that are associated with the brush preset that we have selected. And if we've changed those, unless we create a new brush preset based on those changes, anytime we come in and click on that same brush preset, it'll reset back to those default preset settings. So with that said, let's come up here and kind of take a look at some of these buttons along here. Now we're going to skip over this one. We're going to learn about this guy here a little bit more in the next lesson. But remember how when we came to layers over here, we actually have blend modes that we can utilize for the different layers. And those blend modes change how a layer reacts with the layers underneath it. Well, we actually have blend modes that can be assigned to the paint that we are painting with. So if we wanted to paint with something like multiply, we could paint, and it would basically look at everything underneath and multiply that paint on top of it. So we're going to work with just the normal blend mode, but coming over here, we have an opacity setting. Now, if I come in and paint with this particular brush stroke, you can see here, that's a 100% opaque brush stroke. It's actually 100% solid. There's no transparency at all. But if we were to come in here and begin to sort of dial down the opacity, and I painted with, say, something like 50%, you'll notice that my opacity is something much, much lighter. And sort of illustrate this, let me go ahead and step back a couple times by hitting Control-Alt-Z, and maybe we wanted to come over and paint this guy's shirt. So with my opacity set at 100%, let's come in here and paint kind of a little section right here, and then I'm going to come over here and drop that opacity down, and we'll paint in a little section right there. Now if I were to drag this particular layer up above this line work layer, the area where I painted 100% opacity is going to completely hide the line work. But the area right here where I was only at 50%, we can still see that line work through. So that's actually a good illustration of kind of the transparent nature that is incorporated when we begin to adjust the opacity. So flow is something a little bit different. I'm going to ramp my opacity back up, and I'm going to choose maybe my soft preset here. So flow, on the other hand, is the rate at which paint is leaving your brush. So at 100% flow, that paint is coming out really, really quickly. But if we start to dial that down, you'll see here that the flow is reduced. It's almost like that paint is being constricted or shielded from coming out of the brush. So that is what the flow setting here does. Now let's go ahead and ramp this back up, because with our flow turned all the way up and our opacity turned all the way up with this soft brush, notice what happens when I just tap on my canvas here and I hold. We get sort of a fuzzy blue dot. Now, we can always enable a feature known as airbrush here for our brushes, and this is actually a button right over here. So if I tap on that here, and now I tap and hold, you're going to see how that paint just starts to accumulate. It's continuing to layer itself onto the canvas, and my dot ended up getting much, much larger because of that. So if you've ever used a traditional airbrush, this is trying to mimic that effect. So I'm going to come over here and erase this with my eraser. And, you know, we've talked about some basic settings for our brushes. And, you know, these are settings that you'll probably actually see with many of the tools that utilize Photoshop's brush engine. You'll have an opacity and a flow setting, as well as possibly blend modes available to you for that particular tool. Now, looking here at our brush again, there's some really basic stuff we need to learn how to do and do much quicker. So first thing I want to show you how to do is access this brush preset picker. So we can always come up to our control panel, but it's much quicker to just simply right click on your canvas, and you'll get that exact same brush preset picker right here. Now, in terms of the size and the hardness, there's actually keyboard shortcuts we can utilize for those. So let's talk about size first. Probably one of the easiest ways to increase and decrease the size of our brush is to use the bracket keys right over the enter key on our keyboard. So the closed bracket key is going to make our brush size larger, and the open bracket, or the first bracket there, is going to make it smaller, just like so. And you can see I'm still using my soft brush, so let me undo and right click and choose this hard brush again. There we go. Now, in terms of another way to do that, there's actually another way that works really well for me because I'm painting with a Wacom Cintiq, and I have my right-click configured to one of my stylus buttons. Now, for me, I like to hold down the Alt key and right-click, and that allows me to dynamically drag right and left, and I can increase and decrease the size of my brush. Notice if I drag up and down, I can increase and decrease the hardness of my brush as well. Really quick and easy just by holding Alt, right-clicking, and dragging around on my canvas. Now, at this point, we can also utilize the keyboard to adjust the hardness of our brush. I'm using a hard brush, but what happens if I hold down the Shift key and maybe hit that open bracket or that first bracket key? You can see that I'm reducing the hardness. I hit that a few times. Let me hit it Shift, close bracket once. And you can see it went up 25%. So we can incrementally adjust both the size of the brush and the hardness of the brush using our bracket keys. All right, great. Now, ultimately, we have just taken a really basic introductory look at brushes here, just looking at some of the very basic settings that we can apply up here in the control panel. In this lesson, we've learned about brush size and brush hardness. We've also learned about things like brush opacity as well as brush flow. So let's go ahead and continue our lesson on brushes in the next lesson, and I'm going to show you how we can even begin to further customize our brushes using Brush Dynamics.